Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you had an enjoyable lunch. Please join me in welcoming our webcast viewers. My name is Andrew Graham, and I'm president of the Canadian Club of Toronto, and I'm your host for today's luncheon. Viewers, thank you for joining us. Our club is proud of a track record of bringing you decision makers and thought leaders to discuss the issues of the day. We've reflected a lot on the impact of the internet on different businesses, and certainly we've thought a lot about the impact of the internet and technology on our own business, on our own organization. And I think it was possible a few years ago to be very worried about an organization like the Canadian Club that hosts in-person luncheons to hear speakers talk in sound bites that are longer than 280 characters. But in fact, I think our club has not only weathered this challenge, but actually emerged very strong because of it. In an era when many people consume news in very small bites and consume news from outlets that agree entirely with their point of view, it's refreshing to come to hear long-form discussion and to be at a table with people that in some cases may agree with your political point of view or may disagree with it. If anyone is sitting at a table with someone you found disagreeable, please put up your hand. We can skip that. Let me thank today's event sponsors. BMO, represented by David Jacobson. Denton's, represented by Blair McCready. We appreciate your generosity. And I'd also like to thank Julie DiLorenzio, who has sponsored the participation of our youth and young leaders table, and they are joining us today from De La Salle College, Oaklands, and C.W. Jeffries Collegiate Institute. Where are you? Where are you today? Can we have those tables stand up or wave or something? Where are you folks? I think at the back there. Now it's time to introduce our speaker. The 22nd Prime Minister of Canada hardly needs an introduction, but the formality of the occasion calls for one. For almost a decade, he led our country through times of prosperity and times of austerity. As Prime Minister, he focused on building a strong, stable economy, bolstering our defence systems, and protecting Canada's interests in a turbulent world. The Right Honourable Stephen Harper may have left federal politics, but his insights and perspectives are still sought after by many. I thought the Globe and Mail made an apt remark earlier this week when it said, looking globally, he is one of the century's most electorally successful mainstream Conservative leaders. I think that's very true. Given the turbulent times we live in, his latest book, I think, is perfectly timed. Indeed, right here, right now, Politics and Leadership in an Age of Disruption addresses a wide range of issues which we'll hear about shortly. It draws on his role as a G7 leader and helps readers navigate and succeed in a period of unprecedented disruption. Mr. Harper is a man of many titles: economist, entrepreneur, author, political leader, and of course, Prime Minister. As Canada's 22nd head of government, he served from 2006 to 2015. But leaving federal politics hasn't slowed him down. He serves as chairman and CEO of Harper and Associates Consulting. The firm advises clients on how to address global business risk. He is often invited to speak to international audiences about investment trends, trade, and geopolitics. Earlier this year, Mr. Harper was elected chairman of the International Democrat Union, the world's preeminent alliance of center-right political parties. Mr. Harper is joined on stage by John Walsh, Managing Director, General Counsel, OP Trust. As Managing Director, General Counsel, Mr. Walsh provides legal counsel to all of OP Trust and oversees all corporate governance, compliance, enterprise risk management, and transactional structuring matters. Before joining OP Trust, Mr. Walsh practiced corporate and securities law for a decade at two leading Canadian law firms. Mr. Walsh has also worked at senior levels of politics and government in Canada and the United States. We look forward to this insightful discussion. Mr. Walsh, Prime Minister Harper, the Canadian Club podium is yours.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you for having us. As past president of the Conservative Party, I'm the completely unbiased and nonpartisan moderator. I've had the pleasure of knowing the Prime Minister for a long time and working together Prime Minister, in an age when certainly retired politicians tend to write about the past, you've written a book about the present and the future, right here, right now, politics and leadership in the age of disruption. What was the impetus for the book, and who is your target audience?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, everybody, for being here. I just should begin by saying I look around the crowd and I recognize a huge percentage of this audience, former colleagues in Parliament, staffers, associates, some friends going back to before my political days. So I'm delighted that all of you could make it here today, and also really delighted, as I've told, I think I told a crowd in Banff recently, delighted that I could be up here with John. Those of you who are active in our party know that one of the most difficult and unsung roles is to be president of a political party. There's an awful lot on your plate, and people only hear about you if things go wrong, and they never heard about John Walsh. So give John a big hand for the job he did.
No, not at all. Very kind. Thank you.
So the book comes out of really, it was kind of mentioned in the introduction, out of a couple of things I'm doing now. I go around the world and advise business on geopolitical trends, on business risk, what is happening and why, and what should they do about it. And of course, I'm now chairman of the Global Federation of Conservative Parties, CentreRight parties. And as I go around the world, I see a lot of commonalities happening in a lot of different countries. And obviously, the book focuses on some of the things that have happened. Actually, some of the things that have happened since I left office. You know, starting in 2016, the year after I left office, everything went to hell in a handbasket. I'm sure it's just coincidence. But I say I start with the. I start early in the book with my very favorite Donald Trump quote, which is, "What the hell is going on?" That just applies to almost every day when you wake up. But you know, we've had the Trump phenomenon, we've had Brexit, we have these various populist movements in Western democracies, in Europe in particular, excuse me, other parts of the world. And I do see some commonalities here, and I'll just jump maybe right to the thesis of the book. The thesis is essentially the following, that I think we are seeing disruptive political change that is a consequence of technological disruption that is leading to economic, social, and ultimately political disruption, and that really has manifested itself in, you know, essentially a long period in the globalization era where middle and working class people in many countries have had stagnant or even declining wages. And then you had a couple of things happen. You had the global financial crisis, in which in many countries, not of course in Canada, and this is really important to know about the book, although obviously we will sell a lot of books in Canada, the book is not about Canada. Canada is kind of an outlier in just about every trend I'm talking about. But in many countries, you had the global financial crisis followed by the big bailouts for the banks, major corporations, quote, the wealthy, and then 10 years of non-wage growth or even declining economic results for ordinary working people. And I think what you are now seeing is a backlash that is taking the form of kind of fundamental questioning of the policy parameters of the post-Cold War era. Freer markets, freer trade, freer migration. And so what I hope to do with the book is to, first of all, advise people to take this seriously, because I think the approach in many countries to this has been very bad. The reaction to it has been very bad. On the center right, many traditional conservatives simply ignoring it or denying the facts are the facts, and on the center left, often simply deriding or ridiculing or dismissing large percentages of the electorate. And I don't think that is viable either. I think if you look, my kind of surprising conclusion, will surprise some of you, I think if you look at the complaints of the so-called populists in many of these areas, they're actually accurate. They're actually true. I don't think they're necessarily right on the solutions, but if we as conservatives, and the book is primarily addressed to conservatives, also business leaders and any leader, but as we as conservatives are to understand that, then we have to adjust our policy frameworks appropriately. I don't I don't suggest that we should become anti-trade or anti-market or anti-globalization or anti-immigration, but we should recognize there's been some pretty serious problems with the way these things have been done in some countries, and policy change is necessary.
People use the term disruption in a lot of ways, in business and politics, certainly in this current era of innovation. What do you mean when you use the term disruption?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, a lot of people hear the term disruption, and I think they believe it is just a synonym for change. I actually think the two are quite distinct. I believe that change is part of the natural order. Change is just a part of life. It's organic. It happens as a matter of evolution. Disruption is something different. Disruption is a strategic and considered effort to displace and to replace a status quo of some kind. And obviously, we are seeing this in business with technological innovation that is shifting business models all over the place. And as I say, I think you're seeing ripple effects, social norms changing in ways that appear sometimes almost random. Obviously, economic impacts on communities and jobs and people's lives, not all positive. And of course, I say the inevitable consequence of this is you're going to have all this social, economic, and technological change. There's an inevitable consequence in the political arena, particularly when the changes are not always positive for significant groups of people.
And that really comes through in the book, I think. Can I break away from the book in particular for a couple of minutes? Because this is a crowd that certainly, and this is a town and a part of this town that certainly was watching NAFTA negotiations very closely. And I'm not going to try and pronounce the new acronym that's reverse NAFTA. But as you watch that, as someone who has really an unprecedented track record of trade agreements around the world, you must have had some thoughts.
I had a few thoughts that I mostly tried to keep between me and my client. So it's USMCA.
Yes.
I'm tempted to turn around and say MUS because I think in the end it was kind of MUSTA, something like that. So look, I think everybody knows I did not think much of the way it was handled on our side, albeit a difficult situation. I think it is unequivocally, the case is unequivocal that the U.S. got a good deal. I actually think if you're fair and you step back and you look at the trade agenda of the president, through all the chaos and noise in the administration, I think they are actually kind of making headway on their trade agenda. And I could point to several examples, but on this one, they got some pretty clear wins. In the case of our country, we were trying to minimize the losses. And
what was your negotiating style as you're negotiating in Europe, in Asia, around the world? What approach did you take to these extremely difficult negotiations?
There's never one approach. You have different objectives in the case of different countries, and it's very different. Negotiating bilaterally versus multilaterally, and very different if you're negotiating with a party that's commensurate with you or smaller versus someone who is much larger. And I always used to say in the case of when you're dealing with a party that is much larger, it is essential to understand what makes them tick and where they're going. And if you don't get that, you're going to get yourself in very big trouble. Anyway, look, I think in the end, the deal, obviously there are some losses, but the deal gives us comprehensive and largely beneficial access to the American market, so it's essential. The one thing I've said, I do think there's an opportunity in this new arrangement. There's been a lot of commentary about some of the provisions that relate to Canada's possible future relationship with China. And I actually think, I'll use the word kindly, I actually think there are incentives in the deal for the governments of Canada and Mexico to work with the government of the United States on trying to open up the Chinese market. And I think this is actually an opportunity.
Right.
Because all three countries have large and growing imbalances with the Chinese market that are driven by the fact that we have grossly unequal market access. And this is an opportunity to work in a way with the United States to correct that, because frankly, I don't think acting alone, we are capable of fixing that particular challenge.
It certainly seems to be a focus of the president, and there's been lots of commentary that in fact may have been what was driving him in the NAFTA negotiations, was his approach to the China trade imbalance. You certainly had lots of experience working with China. Do you see, and I think lots of business leaders here, where do you see the future for the Canada-China trade relationship? Is it a positive outlook for you? When you talk about that opportunity, is that where you see it?
Well, everybody looks at China and they see opportunity. But the fact of the matter is, not a lot of Western firms and businesses have actually made a lot of money in China.
Very true.
And the Chinese have done very, very well selling into markets like ours. We have, like the United States, I think it's a 3-to-1 trade imbalance. The U.S. is 4-to-1, and we have an even greater imbalance than the U.S. on the investment side. So look, I think it's essential if we're really we talk about the great opportunity that China represents, and I kind of fundamentally believe that, and fundamentally believe that China is a lot better place than it was several decades ago. But if we're really going to take full advantage of that, we have to have that market open. And we have I think this is a serious problem that the West has with China, and that is the essential rules of the WTO admission have created a situation where the Chinese have wide-ranging access to our markets, but we can only sell to China when they say so, in what quantity they say, and for how long they say. And otherwise, it's not an open market. And that is creating a great structural imbalance, and it is undeniable. I know people try and deny it. It is undeniable that this has cost net jobs in countries like Canada and the United States. And the whole theory, I know there are some trade advocates who try and argue that all trade is good trade, and they point to David Ricardo, but the whole principle of comparative advantage is you sell to me and I get to sell to you, and the truth is they get to sell to us and we often don't get to sell to them, and that has to be fixed.
Okay. Yeah, agreed. Agreed. Back to disruption, you use the term technology. You certainly talk about technology in the book. How important is the technology disruption that everybody here is experiencing and all the entities that they work for are experiencing every day? What are you seeing as you're out there traveling the world?
As you know, I work for I have several different clients in the high-tech sector. I spend a disproportionate amount of my time in San Francisco for that reason. And look, in spite of we see some of these negative implications of technology on particular jobs or industry, the fact of the matter is that the story is overwhelmingly positive. Like, we are seeing emerge possibilities in terms of services and health and human life. They're going to come to the fore in the next few years that were only science fiction, just a decade ago. There are just wonderful and positive things happening. But obviously, there are some disruptive economic impacts, and I think in many cases we have policy frameworks that are making those economic impacts negative or worse instead of better.
Right.
So look, it's the one message I have in the entire book. I point to a lot of problems and a lot of challenges, but the reality is this, and this is what distresses me about the level of political disruption, political instability, political uncertainty in the West, is for the most part, these disruptions represent positive opportunity, and we are wealthy societies that have all kinds of ability to respond and adapt and do so successfully. And yet we are seeing in many countries the political realm get to the point where it can't even have rational debate about the problems. And we've got to get past that, because we really could go down a very bad path, whereas we should be going into a new era that means more wealth and prosperity and opportunity for everyone.
I think it was on the weekend in an op-ed you mentioned Joe Lonsdale and others in California, whether at Stanford or other places in the Valley. In your interactions with them, what are they saying about Canada, if anything, and what are they saying about Canada's approach to innovation and our place in the spectrum of countries being able to handle disruption?
Well, they're starting to look, Canada gets a little bit of attention for a couple of reasons. On the first part of your question, some of these companies are getting interested in Canada because a lot of these dynamic, especially the smaller dynamic American IT companies, they are kind of strictly American. And they're starting to look at, how could we expand in the world? And frankly, the culturally and from a business sense, the easiest single place for them to move next is Canada. And we work with some companies, one that's called Terminal, that really it's It's a company that essentially it's trying to disperse work out of the Bay Area.
Right.
One of the great
Expensive place to live.
expensive place to live and recruit, and increasingly impossible. And one of the advantages of the high-tech world should be the ability to disperse
Yes.
industrial and economic activity. So they have been setting up essentially engineering teams across Canada as part of their expansion plans to kind of do labor arbitrage from the Bay market. So that's an example of their interest. On the other issue, and where is Canada getting attention? I do think Canada gets a bit of attention in the fact that, well, you see all this political instability and change in Western democracies. I think most people notice that Canada doesn't have that. Now, I qualify that. Canada has had changes of government, and a couple of them, one in particular, I think was very bad. Just an unbiased view.
I thought the New Brunswick election went well. What are you talking about?
But the fact is the changes of government in Canada are largely of a traditional nature. They're traditional options replacing other traditional options. They're not the kind of disruption, unorthodox, movements from nowhere kind of thing that we're seeing in other countries. So I think a lot of people are asking, why Canada is different. And I think, and that's in a way part of the reason I wrote the book, not because Canada is affected by these trends, because we're relatively unaffected by these trends. I think we have a better idea on maybe how to respond to some of them.
I can only imagine, a bit of a prelude to the question at the end, I can only imagine as someone who, like me, your history in politics, your education, your thinking was so driven by free market trade, and that being just a pillar of what we believe in, what your government certainly forwarded in the country. But yet the book talks a lot about the mistake of not paying attention.
Right.
How does it, as someone who led this country for 10 years, that must have been a bit of a profound realization for you that we could have done that better.
Yeah, look, I'm pretty happy with our own record, but I think the message of the book really comes down to this. I believe that as conservatives, obviously I'd advise other parties the same. I think we should pursue policies that are fundamentally pro-trade, pro-market, pro-globalization, pro-immigration. But is it possible to get these things wrong? Absolutely it is. And let me take the example of trade. I will read kind of, for lack of a better term, libertarian-based articles that will try and claim things like all trade is always good, always and under all circumstances, and we should, just throw open borders all the time. And then you have somebody like Donald Trump comes along and makes statements like, well, there are some bad trade deals. And some people say you can't have a bad trade deal. They're good. Trade deals are good. Well, on this one, I hate to tell you that Donald Trump is fundamentally right. There's a reason. Many of you are business people. You do a deal, you have dozens of lawyers and experts and analysts, and going over the ins and outs of the deal. It's really possible to have a bad commercial deal. It really can happen. And if you look at the outcome of some trade deals or some trade arrangements that the West has made, there have been some not very good outcomes. As I say, I kind of focus a lot on the China situation. When you have a 4-to-1 trade imbalance that just continually grows, even as China's wealth grows, this is a problem. This has bad outcomes on the ground. And we've got to, so it really comes down to, I say, not ditching our fundamental philosophy, but it comes down to an answer or to a bunch of prescriptions that frankly aren't sexy, which is we have to roll up our sleeves, we have to know the details, we have to know the facts. I give the example in my book of when we concluded the Canada-Europe trade agreement, and I was with Jose Manuel Barroso in Brussels announcing that. And I say in the book, we knew that in the next few hours we'd get 1,000 different press releases from Canadian industry, labor, subnational governments, you name it, experts, and not in a single case were we surprised at what the reaction was, because we knew exactly what we were signing. We knew where people would win, where they would lose, where we would struggle. We knew what adjustment measures we would have to take. We weren't guessing about this stuff. I mean, you're always guessing to some degree, but we weren't guessing about the basic facts. We weren't being surprised to find out there was some clause we didn't know about or couldn't explain. We knew what industry's positions were, where they thought they could best manage a transition and where they couldn't. And you have to do this kind of work. And I do think in many cases, if I don't mind me saying, particularly our friends to the south, they have often pursued something like trade arrangements from much broader kind of philosophical or foreign relations criteria and not paid as much attention to the outcomes as they should have.
It's actually kind of interesting. When I was reading the book, I was struck by kind of the irony of when free trade deals, in particular NAFTA, was signed, there was, in globalization and those who oppose it, sometimes violently, the thesis is that globalization is bad for the developing world. The reality that you point out in your book is the developing world, we've brought so many people out of poverty through trade, but yet back at home, we, in the US and other places, I agree with you, certainly not necessarily here, we forgot about something we probably should have seen coming.
Yeah, look, I'd say that a lot of the conventional critiques of globalization that we've heard for 15 years, primarily from the left, a lot of them are just wrong. Globalization has been overwhelmingly good in the developing world. We have 1 billion people coming out of poverty under globalization. There has never been as successful a reduction of human misery in human history than we have seen under the globalized economy from the late 1980s forward.
Hear, hear.
It is a remarkable achievement, and it's largely based on trade. And we've also seen, contrary to a lot of critiques, we've actually seen a reduction in global inequality as a consequence. But in developed countries, we've often seen an increase within developed countries in inequality and income inequality in ways that I think are troubling. And obviously in many Western countries, we've seen some pretty strong net negative impact.
Taking some questions from the audience, which I'm sure will be a lot better than mine. This one certainly is. As a student, I wonder if economics is the right choice if I want to be PM someday. Worked for you.
I think I'm the only.
I think you might be right.
Maybe
Usually it's just
William
lawyers.
Mackenzie King might have been he might have been an economist. I'm sure I was the only economist in my entire government caucus, which is kind of ironic. But I thought,
John, are you going to claim to be an economist as well?
John will claim to be whatever you want him to claim. But look, I got an applause on that one. I've got the mic and you have. This is so much fun. Look, I thought my kind of academic education as an economist, and I took all the standard part of the programming, including econometrics and all that, but I also took an unusual amount of kind of economic philosophy and also economic history. And I thought all these things, just turned out to be the perfect education for the kind of problems I ended up facing.
Yeah, during the time you were there, I'm sure it came in pretty handy.
It did.
You have taken on the leadership of the IDU, which you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
The Alliance of Center-Right Parties. What are the common challenges or solutions that you see right of center parties dealing with globally? You just met with them in LA
I did.
a month ago.
Many, as I say, many of these parties are facing very similar challenges. They see often the rise of populist movements on their right. Not all populist movements are on the right these days. There's some that are on the left, but a lot of them are on the right. And a lot of them are losing a lot of votes to those. Some are not. Some are adapting successfully. Others are losing votes in a great number. One of the myths, though, is that kind of a lot of these populist or nationalist movements you see in Europe are really coming principally out of conservative parties. Often they're not. They're often coming principally out of the left. And while many center-right parties are under a lot of stress, their traditional electoral coalition is under stress, it's actually the case in most of these countries that the center-left party is under even more stress. Because what you see happening on the center-left in many countries is a three-way split. You see kind of what I would call the core of it staying with what I would call elite liberalism. You see another part of the left that is going back to kind of their socialist economic roots. And then you see a lot of people who are attracted to protectionism and conservative social values and going to the populist parties of the right. And you have in countries like France and Germany, Italy,
yeah.
the traditional center-left party is on the verge of collapse. In Great Britain, you have I think, an even scarier phenomenon, which is, in which, I think you see some threats of in the United States, which is the takeover of the party by extremists. I mean, you are literally seeing in Britain, not just Jeremy Corbyn take over the Leader Party, but now successive purges of people who do not share their various extremes, and not just Marxism, anti-Semitism, and a whole range of sympathy for terrorists. I mean, a whole range of really scary stuff. So the stresses are even greater on the left, which is why I think as center-right parties, we have a better ability to adapt and respond to the public angst. The beauty of the IDU is the ability to come together and share best practices and try and learn from successes and from mistakes. Because let me just say this, John, this is, to me, I know a lot of people are concerned and not without merit to be concerned about some elements of what they see on the populist right. But in my judgment, we can manage this if we adjust our policies. What could happen on the left, to me, is the much greater concern. And I'm concerned if we do not respond positively to what we see on the right, we are going to eventually end up with essentially Marxist socialist governments in some countries. That would put Western economies in a globally competitive world on an irreversible decline.
And when you say respond positively, you mean actually listen to people's complaints?
Actually
pay attention
listen,
to where they're at?
actually adjust the economic policies to deal with some of these concerns. And let me give you a concrete one. As you know, as a Conservative government, we were a tax-cutting government. We believe strongly in reducing taxes. But, you will constantly get elite Conservative voices saying, you've got to cut corporate taxes, and you've got to cut high marginal rates, and maybe even increase sales taxes and bring in carbon taxes. And if we're going to pursue a tax agenda that's going to benefit the society at large, it has to be across the board. And we can't just have tax cuts that are only helping the top end of society, because not only do we lose political support, but frankly, those don't have as good economic outcomes over time.
We talk a lot in the business community about private capital and where it's going and how it's flowing. There's obviously a real concern in Canada that investment capital from the rest of the world isn't coming in at the same pace that we would either like or it has in the past. What are your thoughts on that, and how does that play into the thesis of the book?
I'd say the book is not about Canada. Canada really hasn't experienced most of the things I'm talking about in the book. Of course, we're not immune. You do the wrong set of policies, you get the wrong set of outcomes, and you start to get, you will get the political disruption here as you do anywhere else. Look, I just will say this, John. I think everybody knows I remain on the board of the Conservative Fund, assist our leader, Andrew Scheer, in his fundraising efforts, and I try not to comment day to day on the current government. I leave that to our party. I think he's doing a good job, and I look forward to him winning the election in 2019.
Minority or majority government? No, I'm kidding. I won't put you on the spot with that. So if the Republicans continue to take traditional Democrat voters, will we see a fundamental shift in the ideology of both? Talk about what you see in those parties.
Well, as I say, what I say in the book, as I look at this whole series of election results we are having, I actually see in many countries this disruption is causing the political spectrum to shift in its entirety. And it's becoming less defined by our kind of traditional notions of left and right, which I think are really around issues of market versus government involvement. And it's becoming, in many countries, increasingly a spectrum that is defined by kind of, for lack of a better term, extreme of elitism at one end and extreme of populism on the other end. Probably the most notable example of this, in a way, would be Italy. Italy has a government now. I talk about all these changes in government and how unusual they are. I'm not going to try and tell anyone a new government in Italy is a remarkable event. But the current government...
People wonder if there's been a new one since you got here. Right?
Yeah. But the new government in Italy is fascinating in that it is a coalition of two new populist parties, relatively new populist parties, of the right and the left. This would be literally as if Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders we're in a coalition together. And you often find in many of these countries, increasingly in the narrowing space of traditional parties, you see the traditional left and right in coalition against the populist left and right. And so I think in some cases you're seeing the spectrum shift entirely. And I don't think that's a really healthy thing. But once again, I think the solution to that for conservatives is to seek a ground where we respond to the legitimate concerns of the kind of masses of working people, but do so in ways that reflect well-considered policy based on experience and based on facts.
Is it, when you really boil it down, anywhere people and somewhere people, are those cultures, and are they cultures that parties can actually tap into while still demonstrating themselves ready to be government? It seems to me that the cultural aspect is something that we don't see political parties addressing in a way that is meaningful, other than, as you say, either to ridicule or to deride.
Well, look, a big part of this increasing political cleavage is a kind of a cultural outlook dispute, and the somewheres versus anywheres, kind of the crowd that globalization has created of, well, frankly, I'd probably fit in it myself. People who do business around the world, contacts around the world, less and less rooted in a particular place, the so-called anywheres versus the somewheres. I borrow this from another author, but I think that is a phenomenon. And the phenomenon there, and this is where the disconnection has happened, so-called anywheres, people with essentially a pro-market, pro-globalization, pro-immigration, pro-trade outlook, they are actually, people who kind of live in this global world are actually a tiny percentage of the population, even in the most advanced countries. But they dominate virtually all public debate. Almost so-called mainstream media in most countries is almost entirely oriented towards that crowd, which is one of the reasons why when we are having, the scary thing about the election results you're seeing is not just that they are so different and that some of these options are in some cases genuinely threatening. It's that no one sees them coming. No one actually sees them coming. And I think all of us, the real phenomenon of Donald Trump is that nobody thought he could win. And nobody thought he could win. Very few people thought he could win even in the closing days of the campaign. So this is the part we've really got to step back and think about. So when that happens, don't get mad at the electorate. That seems to be the response on both the traditional right and left. Don't get mad at the electorate. You got to think, why were you so wrong? And what can you do to better understand what's going on out there?
Certainly a lot of that.
And there's not enough of that.
Yep. A lot of CEOs, senior business leaders in the room, they're trying to navigate this disruptive political/economic time that we're in. What do you say to them about how they need to be thinking about, not today, but next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? If you could give them a bit of advice before we close, what would it be?
Well, I'd give them 2 or 3 pieces of advice. Obviously on the business side, you have to be kind of current with technology and technological evolution. I wouldn't want to say on the cutting edge of technology. Sometimes being on the cutting edge can be very expensive and very experimental, but not far behind that. You can't afford to get technologically out of date. But I think the big message from this era, independent of my observations about particular political parties or elections, the big observation is the one I just made, which is that we are seeing public opinion form in ways that we are unable to predict, often unable to measure, and this is happening very rapidly. And so the best thing you can do is to try and position yourself in ways that before anything ever happens, insulates you against the effects of rapid political change. And so the fundamental advice that we give to businesses around the world, obviously it depends on industry and location and everything else, is the following. It is very important to recognize that in the future, the Western world is going to be like we have seen in emerging economies. You cannot think that you are going to do business simply on the basis of contracts and law. Doing business in the future is going to become inseparable from building a wide network of intimate social relationships. When you are in a marketplace or in an area where you're producing, your network has to know the people who are your suppliers, your customers, your communities where you're involved, your supply chains. These people have to know what you are doing for them and why you are good for them. And you must proactively make sure they understand your message and story and value your relationship. And you must yourself conduct yourself in ways that insulate you from looking like you are acting socially irresponsibly. Because if you are doing those things, you are exposing yourself to some instant public crusade that could be very damaging. And once you're in it, you're probably never going to get out of it, or you're never going to exit it very quickly. So the best thing to do is try and proactively position yourself in a decent way, which doesn't mean, by the way, that you shouldn't make money. I happen to believe that the system works well when people make money.
I think you got agreement in the room on that.
Yeah, you find profit opportunities, but make sure others understand how they are benefiting from the profits that you make.
Every vice president for government affairs and communications in the room thanks you for the pitch.
Yeah.
Prime Minister, thank you for this chat. Thank you for the book. I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's a unique book for a political leader to write, because it's really translating what's happening now based on the multitude of experiences that you've had. And I think there are some tremendous insights in the book, and I think everyone here who has a copy of Right Here, Right Now, Politics and Leadership in the Age of Disruption will have a great time reading it, and we appreciate your thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thanks.
That was great. Cheers.
Well, thank you, everyone, very much. Prime Minister Harper, on behalf of the Canadian Club of Toronto, I want to extend our thanks for you sharing your very thoughtful and informed analysis of the issues of the day. It's at a very timely and unsettling time for many of us. Our club is honored that you have chosen our podium to address some of the issues that we are grappling with. A few things that I would just take away from the conversation that you had, and first was a note of optimism. Even though we talk a lot about technological disruption, your point around the huge opportunity that this presents, I think, is something that's important for all of us to take away. And the other was the point around China. And even though I think we're all wondering what the future holds in this regard, the fact that you see an opportunity to right that balance, and for us to be able to work together to do that, I think, is an important takeaway. Aside from that, I think there are two memorable points that you made that particularly resonated with me and perhaps others in the room. And one was, being in the business myself, make sure others are benefiting from your ability to make money. I think that's a very important truism that I think a lot of companies understand and work very hard at trying to communicate. Sometimes it's difficult to get through that clutter. And the other takeaway that really resonated for me was the point you made about how the Western democracies, we're wealthy countries, and we have all kinds of ability to respond and adapt to the change and the disruption we're seeing. And we can't, but at the same time, we can't even have a rational debate about that. And I think that's something also that I think we all should be thinking about. With that, I once again want to thank you, and we wish you all continued success in all of your roles going forward. And we miss you. Mr. Walsh, thank you for agreeing to join us on the stage for this important discussion. Your passion and intelligence shines through, and you were certainly up to the task, and we appreciate you taking the time to join us today. And before you leave us all, I want to take the opportunity to just highlight some upcoming club events. On Wednesday, October 17th, the chairman and CEO of Cisco, Chuck Robbins, will be at the club to talk about building a business that matters. And on Thursday, October 25th, we will be hosting the Honourable Lisa MacLeod, Minister of Children, Community and Social Services. So we please welcome anyone and everyone here to attend any of those events. Once again, I would like to thank today's event sponsors, BMO and Dentons, for their generous support. We would also like to thank MediaEvents.ca, Canada's online event space, and VVC for live streaming today's event. Thank you all for being with us today, and I wish you a great afternoon. Thank you.